This morning we heard a lot of great information about fire on the airplane and smoke on the flight deck, and now we'll dig a little bit deeper. Our next panel will discuss the resource that ALPA has consistently reminded our industry colleagues is the single most important safety feature on an airliner, the pilot. And with that, human factors aspect of dealing with emergencies. Our moderator for this session is Captain Frank Cheeseman, who is ALPA's chair of the Human Factors and Training Group. So with that, I'm going to turn the panel over to Frank.
Thanks, Jack. Can everybody hear me? Back and running here? Okay, good. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Welcome back from lunch. Like Chuck said, it's always easy to have the first slot after lunch, after your 2,000-calorie lunch. So if I see anybody bobbing off, particularly on the panel, then you let us know if someone nods off here, and we'll do the same for you. So, but anyway, thank you for coming and welcome. This is a great panel. But before we get going on, I want to take a minute to just thank our ALPA professional staff. And they do a phenomenal job every year of getting us ready and doing all the technical pieces that make this all work. So they do just a fabulous job. I wanted to thank them for that. And also our panelists, thank you again for joining us today. It makes a difference. And also to all the volunteers that are here, this is a great turnout. This is probably year 7 for me. It's one of the biggest turnouts I've seen. So thank you so much. Well, this morning you've heard a lot of technical issues about lithium batteries, about dangerous goods, carriage, fire on board aircraft, and it's all wonderful presentations. Smoke, fire, fumes, equipment on the airplane, all of those things from our second panel. But what I'd like to do today, this afternoon, is take you from the ground to the air. And so let's take a minute and look at this flight today. We are going to look at a flight between Chicago and New York. The weather conditions are excellent. You are about halfway to New York and enjoying your flight. It's a domestic operation. You're at flight level 310. Again, there's excellent weather for both the departure and arrival. You're up there at cruise altitude, having a snack, monitoring the operation the way you're supposed to, and effectively discussing family and friends and all of the things that we do as airline pilots. Shortly thereafter, you hear a chime. And the chime is from our cabin crew in the back of the airplane. And the comments to you are, Captain, First Officer, we're starting to smell some smoke back here. There's a strange odor in the cabin. And as you ask them to continue to investigate, shortly thereafter you have a cargo fire indication in the airplane. Depending on what airplane you're on, it could be an ICAS, an ECAM, or whatever sensing system you have. At that point, you start to sense some hazy, smoky conditions in the cockpit. You perform the immediate action, donning your oxygen mask, checking 100% on the mask, and ensuring crew communication between both pilots. Now, one interesting comment. This is the 25th anniversary, as you all might know, or have thought about, of United 232. And of course, I'm going to paraphrase Captain Al Haynes here, and I'm out on a limb doing that. But one of the things that Al always told us at United is when this happened, he said to himself, is this really happening to me right now? So in today's terms, it would be, really? You know, is this really going on? And then kind of things kick in and you start responding to the emergency and using all the tools. So with that said, let's take a look at our experts, our panel lineup. First, we have First Officer Helena Reidemar. She's Director of Human Factors for ALPA, does a phenomenal job for us. Dr. Barbara Burian, Research Psychologist at NASA Ames. Captain David McKenney, Director of Pilot Training for ALPA. And finally, Captain Christopher Reed. Chris is the Manager of Advanced Qualification Programs at JetBlue. So we want to thank them and welcome them. So first, Helena, I'm going to hand it over to you in just a second. but I wanted to acknowledge a couple things that you have done for this profession. First, I want to thank you for your participation in the pilot monitoring program that you've done. Congratulations on that. You've done phenomenal work. You've been recognized by the Royal Aeronautical Society. Thank you. And also, you bring an immense skill set to us finishing up your PhD in aviation safety, and I thank you for that. So with that said, you got it.
Thanks, and thanks for that, Frank.
You're welcome.
First of all, I want to say that it was genius to have Bill DeGroe's panel on this morning. Couldn't imagine a better panel of experts to highlight the human factors in the flight deck and all that occurs with a smoke fire event. So, as Frank said, we're going to talk about a hypothetical smoke fire event and ask pretty much any pilot, what's the worst thing that can happen in the cockpit? They'll tell you smoke or fire. And one of the immediate sort of critical aspects of that is startle and the startle effect. So let's talk about that a little bit more. So the initial warning is shocking, as anyone who has experienced it will tell you. Not long ago, flying back from Sao Paulo in the middle of the night over the Amazon, we got a very loud, sudden warning bell, lights flashing. We had a crew rest compartment smoke. I can tell you that Startle might not even begin to tell you how we were feeling at that time. So we've heard a lot about startle and surprise over the last few years, notably when talking about sim fidelity and training. Startle is a physiological response. It's uncontrollable. Can slow reaction time as much as 5 to 10 seconds. And it's a reflex present from birth, so there's nothing we can do about it, essentially. It happens. So a startle reflex we're all familiar with is eye blink. For example, something comes at your eye, you blink reflexively, may even swat it away. And that's the kind of reaction we're talking about. And let's keep in mind that it doesn't have to be an emergency that creates the startle. It can be an abnormal, anything that feels immediate and life-threatening, even in severe turbulence. So in the Air France 447 accident, it includes startle effect as a causal factor. It's very important to keep in mind, and they found that initial and recurrent training programs as delivered today do not promote and test the capacity to react to the unexpected. Training exercises tend to be repetitive and known to crews. So surprise is psychological, on the other hand, whereas I mentioned startle is physiological. We can create surprise scenarios in the sim, but not a startle scenario. We know we can walk away from the sim. It's not a life-threatening sensation. Some impairments due to startle. We talked about the 5 to 10 seconds. May not be able to accurately recollect and perform memory items. That's pretty important. Varying levels of cognitive dissonance, that slows reaction time. And there may be a problem re-engaging. Fight or flight response, acute stress response. An FAA simulator study last year in Oklahoma City in the 737 sim, Jeff Schrader, Chief Scientific and Technical Advisor to the FAA, conducted startle event and sim efficacy research. And 45 crews participated, 45 pilots participated, and they were briefed on the expected stall recovery techniques to be performed in the simulator. Once they conducted the stall, 73% performed and executed the recovery techniques properly. Pretty good number.
Yeah.
But when unexpected tailwinds were inserted on the approach, only 22% correctly recovered from the stall event. That's pretty fascinating. So to sort of back it up a little bit too, once you've overcome the startle surprise, you have a lot of other human factors challenges. I was an FO instructor for 10 years, and sort of piggybacking on what David Lawrence said this morning, mask goggles or full face mask for fire smoke events in the sim is one of the least favorite things that we as pilots do in the simulator. The mask is cumbersome. It doesn't always seal perfectly. It can fog up. And let's not even talk about putting glasses on underneath it. So you can lose peripheral vision. Movement is restricted. In a real life situation, as we saw this morning, there's possible obscurations due to smoke. Communications can be a chore via interphone. It's challenging. You're likely in an emergency descent. Figuring out the closest place to land, communicating with ATC, declaring an emergency, briefing the flight attendants, the list goes on and on. Maybe even talking to dispatch. But you're flying the aircraft, you're prioritizing, you're monitoring, and we're all trained to get the aircraft on the ground fairly expeditiously. And it's busy, and the stressors can be extreme. And we all remember ValueJet and Swiss Air. We talked about UPS 6 this morning. Good CRM skills are important every day, but in a situation like this, it's a necessity. Working well together it's essential, but it can make all the difference in the world for survivability in this kind of situation. So my point is, and the experts this morning made similar points, and I can only bring it forth from the human factors perspective as well. It's important to have a plan. Practice putting on the mask, but have a plan. Due to the startle effects and all of the human factors implications that I just mentioned, and that my co-panelists here will expand further on, have a plan that includes awareness of these kinds of issues. It's imperative for survival.
Good. Thanks, Helena. I have a question for you as we move through. What role can training play in, and we'll get a little bit more to this later with Chris, but in terms of trying to mitigate the acute stress response, can you expand on that a little bit? There's things we can do in training to prepare a crew for this, and what are some of the other indications of the acute stress response?
Well, let's define the acute stress response a little bit further. It's important to understand the physiological aspects because we allude to it so often. So acute stress response is the body's way of responding to the stress of startle. So it activates the sympathetic nervous system, which signals the autonomic nervous system, which releases these stress hormones through the HPA axis. That's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And that releases epinephrine or adrenaline. Hang
on 1 second, I want to write that down. Make sure I get that. But go ahead.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's good.
Right, so that it releases the adrenaline into the bloodstream. So once that adrenaline gets into your bloodstream, it speeds up your pulse rate, your heart rate, your awareness intensifies, your sight sharpens, you get more aggressive, blood is redirected to the muscles. All these things are happening to us, and there's nothing we can do about it. That's the way it occurs. And that's part of the process. It's also referred to as fight or flight. So stand your ground or flee. And it's a primal reflex that's designed for survival, dating back to, startled by the saber-toothed tiger. I mean, it goes back. So, and we wouldn't necessarily want to change that because we do need that. But we want to be able to deal with the effects of it, and maybe understanding it a little bit better would help that. As far as training, there's not much we can do, essentially, to train away a reflex. There are some techniques to aid in handling acute stress response. Should come as no surprise, a good lifestyle, general good lifestyle, good sleeping habits, exercising regularly. There is something called relax at will, which is sort of a daily exercise you can do. I do yoga. It's very helpful. And the physiological aspects are beyond voluntary control, but you can sort of manage some of these stressors for better responsiveness. One method I've been hearing about a lot recently is used by SWAT teams and combat groups and high-performance athletes. A SWAT team, for example, they're trained to immediately before engaging in some kind of altercation to conduct a series of super belly breaths, they call it, and it involves really deep breaths. And if you think about it, We've always heard, take a deep breath. Well, here's a series of really deep, super belly breaths, and SWAT teams are doing it. I know the Norwegian Air Force has been trained to do this. So, as the name suggests, it's breathing exercises, and it can help normalize the effects of adrenaline in the bloodstream. So, there's no way to eliminate it, but we can certainly mitigate it.
Sure. Well, that's great. One additional question I have that just popped up. The acute stress response, would that be amplified by a fatigued crew?
I would guess.
Where would fatigue kind of fit into this?
Well, you wouldn't be able to handle it as well.
Okay.
It's a well-rested crew performs
Absolutely.
much better, of course.
So, and that makes sense. But so it sounds like even just the physiological responses would be amplified by the fatigued crew.
I would definitely say that, yes.
Right. Good. Well, thanks very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Barbara Burian. She is a friend of this profession. She's a friend of ALPA. Never says no. She's always there for us. And we want to thank you for what you do for us. Year in, year out, consulting, and just a great friend of ours. The grading standard for an incident like this, and I don't want to give too much away for Steve Jangelis' panel later today, but we're going to hear from an actual pilot that's been involved in a pretty severe incident. And if you ask that pilot, what's the grading standard? And we're used to plus or minus 10 knots, plus or minus 100 feet. The grading standard for this situation is survival. It's pretty simple. That we get it's not a simple series of events, but the grading standard is survival. The key to surviving is proper decision-making, workload management. So with that said, Barbara, you have it.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I guess before I launch into what I was going to talk about, I want to thank you, Frank, for your very kind words, and to say that it's actually my honor as a psychologist doing research at NASA to be able to work so closely with people in the industry. Without really the connection with you, not only would I be a lot less happy in my job, but I feel very strongly that our work needs to be grounded in reality, and that what we're doing needs to be something that is applicable and useful to the industry. And so it's only by working very closely with you that helps to ensure that that happens. So I'd like to thank you for all that you do in that. So Helena talked a little bit about sort of the initial reaction that crews might have in response to these kinds of events. So I'm going to kind of pick it up from there and say, okay, you now are aware that you have this event, so now you need to be, kind of assessing it, making some decisions, and managing your workload. And there's a lot of different factors that are going to affect how you approach decision-making and workload management, and so I've got some of them listed, and I'm going to hit them all quite briefly, actually. So the first thing has to do with, in terms of a driver for your decision-making, has to do with what you know versus what you don't know. And this was talked about already this morning, and you know this from all of the kinds of emergency and abnormal situations that you encounter. You've got alerts and cues, and in our scenario, we've got a cargo fire, so you're going to have an alert that tells you that you've got a cargo fire. You also have flight attendants in the back saying, hey, we smell something funny. So you've got that kind of information going. But in other kinds of events, sometimes the alerts and cues are not so clear-cut. Sometimes they can be fairly ambiguous or even contradictory. It's not unusual for you to get alerts that seem to be in opposition to each other. So, for example, you've got a stall warning going off the same time as an overspeed clacker. So really sorting through the alerts and cues is one of the first things that you've got to deal with. Now, with smoke, fire, and fumes, you also have to be concerned about, what kind of situation do you have? Where's the location? Now, in our scenario, we know that it's in the cargo. At least it's started in the cargo. We don't know how much it's propagated, how many other systems might be involved as you start ending up with sort of possible cascading effects. So you've got to be sort of thinking through all of that. So the amount of information you have relative to all those things is quite important. And probably one of the most important things is an assessment of how much time you have available. And this also was touched on this morning. And I wanted to draw some attention to this because After the Swiss Air 111 accident happened, the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, as part of their investigation, did this little study where they looked at in-flight smoke, fire, and fumes events on 15 different transport category aircraft and looked at, kind of the amount of time that crews had from the time they became first aware that they had such an event to the time that the aircraft either ditched or did a forced landing or crashed. And they found that across these 15 different accidents, the crews had about 17 minutes on average. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is because after this report came out, and even still, sometimes I'll talk to pilots and they'll say things to me like, oh yeah, I know, I've got 17 minutes. And they are not aware of the fact where that number came from and the fact that it refers to an average number and not some sort of absolute that you have 17 minutes to count on. So if you hear that from some of your colleagues, help them, inform them about, that that's actually wrong. Because as an average, of course, you have, times that might be quite longer than that, but also times that are going to be quite shorter. So something else that's going to influence, and we see this quite a bit in terms of decision making, has to do with history and experience. And here I'm talking about your own history and experience primarily, but also the history and experience that your company has, similar types of events, or things that have occurred within the industry, right? We talk about accidents all the time in the industry, and so we learn from what other people experienced. And when someone else had something happen, and now we have an event that somewhat seems similar, we're influenced. Our decision-making can very much be affected by that. One of the points that was made this morning also was about the issue with false alerts from cargo sensors, cargo fires. And there was a study that was done by David Blake in the fire group at the New Jersey Technical Center. And this is a bit dated at this point, but he was looking at basically the ratio of false alarms to alarms when the event was real. And you can see the bar chart there at the bottom. What's probably very difficult to see is at the bottom of some of those very long bars of white is a tiny itty-bitty little bit of red. Do you see the red on a couple of them?
Yes.
A few of them? The red are the real events.
Wow.
The white are false. Now, technology is advancing, and we just heard this morning that they're going to be doing some more studies with regard to different types of sensors, maybe ones that are a bit more sensitive or multi-criteria sensors, to really sort of reduce this issue of false cargo fires. But we have seen a lot of ASRS reports where pilots say, this particular aircraft has a known history of false alerts, and pilots are starting to ignore them or become rather complacent in our response. So that's another way that our history with something can affect us, in this case, not in a good way, right? So Helena talked a little bit about some of the effects of stress in terms of some of the initial effects on your initial response. I'm going to talk a little bit more in terms of the long-term effects of stress as this event is unfolding. So we see it primarily in terms of decision-making and workload management in these ways that I'm going to talk about. So first of all, just because we are human and our brains are hardwired, stress is going to affect us cognitively, our cognitive performance. So very naturally, our attention narrows. And that can be both good and bad, because the good side is that we're focusing on the most essential thing. You've got an emergency, you can ignore some other stuff that's going on around you and really focus on the essentials. But the bad side, the flip of that, is that sometimes there's cues or alerts or other things that you're not paying attention to that would change either your assessment of the situation or your interpretation of what's really going on, all of those different kinds of things. Also, working memory. So this is the type of part of our memory that we use for decision making. We're actively holding information and using it in real time. It's that part of memory where we're taking information from a variety of different sources and we're formulating a picture about what's going on. Unfortunately, with stress, our working memory capacity, the amount of information we can hold in working memory, shrinks. And the amount of time that we are actually able to hold things in working memory also decreases. So this is one of the reasons why when you're under high stress, you may end up having to ask somebody to repeat information multiple times because you just have difficulty holding on to it because there's all these other things that are competing for that little bit of space. In terms of decision making, oftentimes with stress, we tend to consider fewer options before we make a decision. So in terms of, different alternatives, and we're gathering some information, instead of trying to get information from a lot of different sources, we're going to really narrow that down. And that makes a lot of sense if you think about it. It's very functional. You don't have all the time in the world to sit and consider every single perspective or every single piece of information. But again, it has a flip side, because it's possible sometimes that there's going to be important pieces of information that you're not considering in terms of driving your decision making. And again, this is all just very normal, natural, and later Chris is going to be talking about how some of the things that are done in training can help to counteract some of this. You're not going to be able to counteract all of it, because again, a lot of it is just natural as part of who we are. And then the last thing in terms of stress with workload management, it's going to be a lot more difficult to interleave tasks. You're managing multiple tasks at the same time. You do a little bit here, then you go over there, do some checklists. Now you're going to talk to the flight attendants. Now you're worrying about what button to push while you're talking on your mask. So you've got all of these things going on. And it can be, because of that narrowing of attention, it can be more difficult to remember to shift to some other task. So you can get kind of fixated. And it can be difficult to prioritize your tasks. We've heard stories of people who get into the checklist and they just keep working the checklist, and they forget that, wow, maybe right now I need to put that checklist aside because we're getting ready to land, and I'm not configured for landing. So, that sort of shifting gears and being able to identify kind of what's the most important thing. Am I going to keep working this smoke fire checklist? Or maybe now smoke is the more critical issue, and I need to start working on smoke removal, smoke evacuation procedures instead. So all of these kinds of things in terms of deciding what you're going to do, keeping that big picture, are going to be a lot more difficult when you're under high stress. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about issues of communication and coordination. I'm not going to talk at all anymore about the mask. I think that's been covered really well. One of the points that I do want to talk a little bit about, though, is coordination with the flight attendants, because, as you know, with a smoke and fire event, this is one of the few emergency or non-normal events where the flight attendants might actively be involved in actually dealing with the emergency, in helping you manage the emergency, as opposed to, just preparing the cabin for, kind of the downstream effects. So that communication and coordination is absolutely essential, and it's really important to make sure that the procedures for both sets of groups are really consistent with each other. And so I've seen, when I've talked to different airlines, seen occasions where the two sets of crews are on completely different page, have completely different expectations about what the other is going to be doing. And so that's a real problem, given the importance of really coordinating closely. And the other thing that's really important about these kinds of events is that because the flight attendants are a lot of times a source of information to the crew that affects the decisions that you are making, you need to make sure that they have really good training in being able to communicate accurately what exactly is going on, and what the status of, what the effects are of their actions and how well it really is working, and not just sort of being too vague or being too optimistic, but really being able to be as accurate as possible. Those are really essential. So obviously you're going to be coordinating with them. You're also coordinating or talking to dispatch if you have time. And you're also going to be talking to air traffic controllers. And I wanted to bring this up because some of you may not be aware of the fact that actually Eurocontrol does quite a bit of really good training with their controllers in helping crews manage unusual events on the flight deck. And they have sort of this general overall philosophy that sort of drives that. And it's kind of highlighted by this acronym, ASSIST. And I'm sure you probably can't read all of this stuff. If anybody's interested, I'm happy to share this with you so you can see kind of what ASSIST actually stands for. But it's sort of a general overall way of the air traffic controllers are trained to be as supportive as possible to the crews in a wide variety of events. But then they also have these extra cards for specific events that have even additional information. And these cards, and I have the one for smoke and fire in the cockpit, are typically divided into 3 different sections. So they tell the controller, this is what you can expect. You can expect that the crew is going to have heightened stress. You can expect that there's going to be difficulty with comms. or that you may lose comms with them. You can expect that your runway may end up getting closed after they land. So it has all these different kinds of operational things, not only in terms of dealing with the crew, but also for them and their functioning within the tower and the airport environment. So they have kind of things to expect, then reminders to the air traffic controllers, things that they should remember to do or things that they remembered that on their own side in terms of coordinating with supervisors and whatnot. And then they have, even another section about, here's some extra information that you might find useful if it's appropriate to pass on to the crews. So they've really done a lot of really excellent thinking about this. And we, here in the States and at NAC Canada, there's some work that has also been done to really help the air traffic controllers think through and be as supportive as possible on these specific types of events. I've not seen anything quite as structured as this, but I've also not been in touch with those two groups on this issue for a while, so it's possible that they have moved ahead on that. So just something to kind of keep in mind. And then the last thing to think about in terms of the sources of things that help guide our decision-making and workload management are the checklists that we use. So I'm going to set aside for just a second that our event is an alerted event, and I'm going to talk just briefly about unalerted events. And people this morning talked quite a bit about the template that was developed by the industry. I'm going to spend a little time actually showing you what the template looks like and talking to you just a little bit about it. So the previous way that we address these kinds of issues with checklists was to, and again, I'm talking unalerted here, is that you were, as a pilot, expected on your flight deck to determine first what kind of event you had. Is it air conditioning smoke? Is it electrical? Do the sniff test. I don't know. Figure that out first, because you had to be able to make that determination to get yourself to the right checklist. So then once you completed that checklist, usually at the very end of the checklist, and I looked at a lot of these checklists, and I've never seen it anywhere than at the end, and these, again, old-style checklists, would be a statement that would say, if you still have smoke, fire, and fumes, if your checklist actions have not been successful, divert and land, right? So they give that to you as the last item, if they give it to you at all, right? So this was the old way of thinking, the old philosophy. So the old philosophy was really driven by deal with the smoke and fire. Do that first. Let that be your first priority. And then your second priority, at the very end would be worry about landing and that sort of thing. So as Boomer and others this morning were saying, this template that was developed by a very broad constituents, an industry group, has a very, very different approach. And this is kind of a shortened summary version. There's actually more information. If anybody's interested, I'd be happy to share with you how to get the more complete template. I just wanted to get it all on one slide. So I've kind of condensed a bit. But it has a very different philosophy. So if you take a look, item number 1 says diversion may be required. That's put right at the very beginning, because the assumption is that you aren't necessarily going to be successful in this checklist. So they want to get you thinking about a diversion right at the outset. And again, this is a case where there's a lot of discussion and about a debate. Should we just tell them to start a diversion? And the group decided, that they didn't want to necessarily impose that, but to at least give people the mindset, get them thinking, and that your airline may choose to, have slightly different guidance relative to that. So then items, 2 through 4 are all of the crew protection kinds of things, in terms of putting on the oxygen mask, establishing comms, that sort of thing. And then there's these, what they call manufacturer's initial steps. That's 5. And these might actually be several different actions. And these are the steps that are, the gentleman from Boeing, I've forgotten his name, William, Captain, was saying that these are the ones that have been identified for your particular aircraft type, are the steps, the issues that have been identified as being the most likely culprits for smoke and fire on your aircraft. So those are the most likely suspects, the usual suspects. So they'll have you start turning some stuff off. And then we even have a reminder here. Remember, we talked about a minute ago about how human performance is going to be compromised and that you're not necessarily going to be able to hold a lot of stuff and your prioritization. So we've got a reminder here to consider smoke removal at this point. So that's a really different approach. And so what they have done then is have all of these different kind of a really different philosophy about how to approach this. We're going to, without any kind of assessment, start turning some stuff off. That's usually the problem. Don't forget about smoke removal. If you can put the fire out and it's immediately, obvious and you can extinguish it, then do that. If you can't, start a diversion. So that's where 10 is on this list. And then, and only after you've begun your diversion, do you start going through all of these other different items for all of these other different systems problems. And so one of the things they've done is, instead of having all of these separate checklists, one for air conditioning, one for electrical, it's all now integrated, right? So it's a very, very different approach. So the thing I would ask you, coming back to our scenario, would be take a look at the alerted checklists and look at the philosophy, the underlying philosophy that drives the content of those checklists. Does it also assume that you're going to be successful? Do they ever say anything about a diversion, considering it? And if they do, where does that information occur within that checklist, right? So those are the kinds of things to think about when you take a look at some of the checklists. And again, those are the kinds of things that I think the industry has really made a huge jump forward in really rethinking this and giving some much better guidance in terms of helping people really prioritize the actions more appropriately in these very time-critical kinds of events. With that, I want to say thanks.
Thanks, Barbara. That was great. This unalerted checklist concept and choosing diversion airports early, where's the industry on building checklists for the unalerted? Do most carriers have them, or where are we in that evolution for the unalerted?
Yeah. In terms of, are they using the template?
Yeah. So they're using the template that the industry kind of generated?
Yeah.
Or the working group generated?
Because most of the manufacturers, there were actually representatives from all four of the major manufacturers, so
Sure.
Embraer, Bombardier, Boeing, and Airbus were all in the room and were involved in development of this template. When they have been putting together their checklists, they're very much in keeping with that template. But air carriers make changes and tweaks and stuff like that. And I have seen some checklists that are not very consistent or deviate in different ways. And that's actually a study that I'm in the middle of right now, is just sort of looking at the degree to which some of the checklists that are out there really do follow the template guidance, and how much they differ and in what ways and why.
So it's pretty important in many cases to identify a divert airport pretty early on in this. That's what we're hearing.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I think the guidance to consider that at the very beginning is very important.
Right. Because I think one of the takeaways for all of us is that the 17-minute number is just an average.
Yes.
Could be significantly less than that, depending on the situation.
Absolutely.
Great. Thanks. That was excellent. Well, science. We've been talking about science, and it's all great. Now let's talk about flying the airplane a little bit. We have Captain Dave McKenney. He's our pilot training director. And I wanted to just take a second and thank Dave for his work. You've seen it, maybe you've seen it in the area of upsets, his work at ALPA, flight deck automation, all of those things. He's been a tremendous volunteer for the profession. So thank you, Dave, for what you do as well. So we're going to be flying this airplane, let's call it flying under duress, right, Dave? Got an oxygen mask on, you have trouble communicating, not a very friendly environment, people calling you from the back of the airplane. What tools are we going to use to keep this thing pointed in the right direction?
Okay, thank you, Frank.
Sure.
It's a privilege to be here as always, and what I'm going to talk about a little bit is some of the research that we published last year under flight deck automation that's pertinent to our everyday flying, but it even becomes more important when we're talking about emergencies such as this, because we don't have the luxury of taking a lot of time to think about what we're doing. We have to react. And there we go. Okay. So I was the co-chair of the ParkCast Flight Deck Automation Working Group, and we published our report, as it was last year, with 28 findings and 18 recommendations on the operational use of flight path management systems, how the pilots interact with the automated systems, as well as design issues, regulatory issues, safety data collection, all pertinent to our specific job of flying the airplane. I put some of the data sources on there that we looked at. Each of those data sources were specific to flight path management issues. So that wasn't all the accidents that happened during that time, all the incidents, but the ones that pertain to flight path management, because we were trying to look at the user and computer interfaces that we were doing and how we train them. And if you look at the last data source down there, I said 11 operators, 6 OEMs, and 17 training organizations. We did interviews with them because a lot of what the data that's collected doesn't tell us the true story. So we went out and actually talked to the instructors, the evaluators, what were their issues with the automation. So these findings and recommendations that we delivered address, like I said, all these different issues. So let me just look at the first ones there. We'll go right to the first finding. And this was kind of interesting when we really looked at the co-occurrences of why things happened, what they did, why the pilots were successful. And our first finding is pilots are actually, our primary job is to fly the airplane, but we also are there to mitigate all the operational issues that come forward to make sure that we get safely on the ground. The LOSA data only showed that 1 in 10 flights are actually completed as they're originally planned. Even if we put it in the FMS, and as pilots, we probably know that we're always making changes, we're always reacting to something, and how do we train for that? So some of the things that we I've listed up there, some of the items there, adapting to changes in the operational circumstances, threats, managing the errors, equipment malfunctions, and all that. But what we really found too is that even we do a great job, the pilots are there doing a great job, but we still have our vulnerabilities. And those turn out to be manual flight operations, managing malfunctions, the pilot's use of still and working with the automated systems, communications between the pilots. How long have we been doing CRM? Do we think we still be having issues communicating between the 2 pilots or the 3 pilots or whatever we have on board, and also communicating with air traffic control? So we have a lot of areas that we can improve on. So the first finding, or second finding, I'm sorry, that we look at the first item there is manual flight operations. That kind of jumped out at us also. And I'll say right now that when we talk about manual flight operations, we're not just talking about manually flying the aircraft. We're talking about airmanship, the cognitive part of decision making that Barbara was talking about, handling the startle, the stress, the surprise that Helena was talking about. How do we deal with all that? How do we get that aircraft safely on the ground as quickly as possible using the tools that we do have? So if you look at the list there, you see many bullets apply both to our normal operations, but also to the system, the one that we have now. So let me just tie it back to smoke and fumes. Frank said, yeah, we got the mask on, we're started down. Now, as a pilot, and I got a lot of hours in the instructor side as well as the student side, is that how many times have we done a high dive or smoke and fumes, and you have all your automated systems, right? Nothing's failed, but what if that was an electrical fire and everything started being shut down? How are we going to get down? As pilots, we have to be ready to use any way that we have to manage that flight path, from kicking everything, all the automation off and hand flying it, to maybe using raw data, using the mode control panel. Maybe we'll have all of our automated systems. But we've got to make sure that we're trained and we have what we call recency, that we've done that in the near future. Each of you could think to yourselves like that right now, when was the last time that you actually did a smoke and fumes scenario in the simulator? Because hopefully you haven't done it in the airplane lately. But again, you can hold that to yourself. But the thing is we need to do that recency. Energy management. We found that in a lot of the operators' manuals, we don't really discuss a lot about flight path management. We don't discuss energy management. We assume that we have pilots that know how to do that. But if we do, where did we learn that? Did we learn it early in our careers? What airplanes did we learn it on? Did we learn it on smaller airplanes, small twins, and now we're flying large transport aircraft? We need to look at this industry as how do we actually use those automated systems to fly the airplanes that we're flying. And then this happens, there's going to be confusion. There's going to be distractions. I'll admit that I have, like everybody else in here, you put the mask on and all that, you're going to be on the wrong radio. I'm trying to talk outside the airplane. I'm talking to my first officer. I'm supposed to be talking to the flight attendant. I'm talking to the controller, because you forgot to flip the switch because we got, under stress. So how often do we do that? So now you're started down. How are you going to get down? What automated system we're going to use, and then what order we're going to do those. So that becomes very critical in this situation. So to answer part of our finding here, the FAA in January of 2013 put out a SAFO on manual handling operations to get the industry start thinking about how do we actually do these operations and how do we train for it? Because in the simulators, most of us know we're spending most of our time on the autopilot. During our normal operations, we're spending most of the time on the autopilot. So when do we actually get a chance to use all those different modes, whether it's hand flying, raw data, flight directors off, whether it's using the remote control panel and flipping between them. Because a lot of it's not just how do we use it, but it's how do we go between it when something fails or something happens. And just to give you a quick glance here of one of our charts, the green line at the top is the LOSA data. And that shows us what happens in a normal day's operation. Okay, and again, that was almost over 9,000 LOSA flights that we did. So 25% of the flights had some type of manual handling or flight control error that the pilots did. Now, there's a lot of reasons for the errors, but it just shows you that's what's happening in normal days, and is there a way that we can train? I'll come back to that a little bit later, but is there a way that we can train to bring that number down? But look at the next line, which is our accidents. Over 60% of the accidents had a manual handling flight control error, as designated by the board that reviewed the accident. That's significant. That shows you right there that with the stress and everything else, the errors are actually going up as we have that. The blue line underneath is some major incidents that happened also, and you can also see there about 30% had some type of manual handling error. So manual flight operations is important, and mainly with the cognitive side of it as well as the manual handling. In the automated systems, I just wanted to show a couple more here of some of the issues that we had. And again, the report's out there. It's got a lot of information in there that I think everybody should read. And not just because I wrote it all that, but it's when you read it, okay, you'll actually, everybody who's read it, the emails I get back, they're like, wow, that's exactly what's happening. It's exactly what we're not doing in training. And it gives us an idea of what we need to fix and where we need to go forward. And I'll put a little, I'll be in there, I do other talks, but I tell every pilot, I says, when you read that, we're our own training. If you don't get the training you want, you ask for it. And if you look in and there's something that you see that you need and you don't know, next time you go to training, you should be asking that I want to do that training. So I'll get off of that. So let me go on to the next one there. Some of the other significant findings. Operator policy for flight path management, as I already mentioned, most of them, they don't exist that we can find. Task and workload management. We talk about it. A lot of companies, again, everybody's a little bit different, but we talk about it separately, but we don't talk about it with our maneuvers training, with our scenarios as much. I've even seen some instances where we're training pilots on CRM on how to do some of this task and workload management, but they're by themselves. It's distance learning. So if I'm supposed to be learning, how do I do this in a crew concept? I still logically, I have a logical brain, but I can't figure out how I can do that by myself at home on a computer and then move that over to the aircraft and make it work with somebody I've never met before. But anyway, that's me. So task and workload management, the same thing. It needs to be trained with the different maneuvers. Pilot knowledge and skills for flight path management. Again, a lot of assumptions are there that we know how to do it, but do we really know how to use all those automated systems, all the different controls in the flight deck to manage our skills for flying the airplane and getting it to where we want as quickly as possible? Because again, a lot of times, as we've seen in some of these instances with the smoke and fumes, we basically have two pilots up there that are working in solo. You can't even have the time to monitor each other. You're basically both working at it. If you get an emergency, you're on the ground in 5 to 6 minutes. If you think about all the stuff you've got to do, it's going to be very difficult to do everything that we do in normal day operations. Two other significant findings that pertain to this situation would be the current training times and methods. Obviously, for me, we need to change how we do business, how we do some training for CRM issues. How do we train for the unknown? Because a lot of what we do as pilots, as the flight decks become more and more complex, we're seeing more and more things that we can't train for every scenario because we just don't know what they're going to be. So we have to develop tools, CRM tools, of how the crew can manage something that they don't know. Something that hit me this morning, actually, is like I've been on, I started flying glass 25 years ago, and I'm still hearing, what's it doing now? Why is it doing that? There's automation confusion. And yet, as an industry, we don't have any tools to help us determine what that airplane's doing and why. It's just, we're just left up to do whatever CRM things we've done or we've learned. I was like, I mean, it just hit me this morning after I'd written all this. I was like, wow, that, you know, we're still there. We're still hearing the same comments. And the new pilots coming in today, our new hires, are doing the same, saying the same things we were saying 25 years ago. And we haven't done a lot in that arena with automation confusion with this. And again, the flight decks are just getting more and more complex. So we have to come up with something better for the future for that. Flight instructor training qualification. If the flight directors, the flight instructors are doing the training and they don't understand it, how do we expect them to train the pilots? So we have to do a better job of training them so they can pass that information on. And I think that's going to come with scenarios, good scenarios that we can train. Okay, so where do we go from here? And I'll finish up here real quickly. Is you've all heard of, oops. Okay, yeah, we need to train like we fly and fly like we train. And what I mean by that is we still spend a lot of time doing regulatory guidance checkbox, but not really giving the pilots the training that they need to do their job. And what and I think you can all appreciate that, is that we have to be training the tools of what they're going to use out on the line, not just going back for our training and jumping through all these hoops. But let's do that for a small amount, because we still have to do some of that, but spend most of our time doing real-life scenarios in the simulators where there may not be any right answer, but you're using those tools to get into situations where you have to work as a crew, exercise all those CRM skills to get the outcome, whatever that is. So again, a list of different improvements needed. I've talked about most of these already. The big one is integrating CRM through maneuvers training and crew performance, measuring crew performance, not individual performance on some issues. Working with the different flight groups, flight attendants, dispatchers, maintenance, all those people, because we have to work with them in the real world, but yet when we do our annual training, or we don't get to find out what they think, what they know, how they're going to work with it. It's only in the middle of the night, smoke and goggles on, trying to get this airplane on the ground, and we're suddenly trying to figure that out. So when we talk about realistic scenario-based training, it's not just the realistic scenarios, but what it also is that exactly what we're going to see on the line when we see it. Okay. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Dave. That was excellent. The flight path, let's see, the pilot monitoring. I wanted to come back to that. That's become a big issue. We talked about Helena's work on it. And Helena, maybe you could help me out with this. But what was it, a 20-year study the NTSB put out? It was about 84 or 85% of accidents. There was some level of failing to monitor properly.
Yeah, well, actually, yeah. When you combine the contributory and the causal factors, it was actually 93%.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, with that said, Dave, you brought up a very good point. In a smoke, fire, fume situation, we've probably split the cockpit, right?
Yes.
Who's going to be the monitoring pilot? Or how is the monitoring going to occur? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's an excellent question, because even as
I'm going to monitor myself, right? If I'm manipulating the controls.
Both pilots are, first of all, both pilots are flying the airplane and both pilots are monitoring.
Okay.
Okay. So the pilot monitor is just a functional title to kind of
Thank you.
Spread that out. But we're both doing the same thing, which is and again, from a military term, you're both fighter pilots. So you're both operating in isolation right now, but we've never really been trained to do that in a way.
Absolutely.
Another question comes up is in your manuals. Go back and look at your manuals or your training and see how are we actually trained to handle emergencies in your operator at your airline. Who is going to fly the airplane? So is it left up to the captain to decide who's going to fly it? And the answer is probably yes, because the captain's authority. But have you really discussed what's the best options? Who's going to communicate? Mm-hmm. Who's going to communicate with the flight attendants? Who's going to talk out? The captain has to make the decisions. So I can't give you a right answer because it depends on each pilot culture, and within an airline is different. Right. You have to look at your culture and make sure that you have enough guidance that everybody knows exactly what they want to hear, how you're supposed to operate, because we don't want to be figuring that out, again, in the middle of this emergency to figure out who's flying. Right. Something else for the people who develop SOPs is a lot of the SOPs break down. A lot of them, I think, when I look at them, they were developed for normal operations, which is where we are most of the time. So cross-checking on the FMCs or whatever. Can I cross-check? Can I ask the person how it looks, make sure we verify everything before it's executed? No. But yet they still expect us to do it sometimes. Even when we get task saturated, workload goes up. Even on not even an emergency situation, just in everyday operations, some of those break down. So what tools do we have, or have we been provided, or been trained on to use to help us get through that? So that's what I'm saying. That's where we need to really look at how we train in the CRM, because we talk about it separately a lot of times and expect the pilots to figure out how they're going to use that in these scenarios, where if we do more scenario training, where we have the pilots doing that and then we debrief them and have them discuss it, we can actually be training those CRMs and how we actually use that, so we're not second guessing ourselves or trying to figure it out in the middle of an emergency.
That's excellent. So if we have limited monitoring going on, Barbara, and I'm going to be running one of these complicated smoke checklists, either what did we call it, alerted or unalerted? What about checklist construction? What about the size of the print, all those things? Have you done any work on that?
No, I personally haven't done work on the font size, but that's actually, I think, pretty much a standard in the industry now. Most of the checklists that I've seen, people increase the font of smoke fire checklists. But there are other things that can also be done, and some of that I've sort of described in terms of prompting people. Now, the monitoring document that some of us were involved in working on actually addresses monitoring in non-normal conditions.
Under duress.
Right. So we talk about some particular skills or techniques that people might use to make sure that monitoring doesn't fall completely away.
Sure. I'm going to throw a plug in here. We have an extra minute or two. Helena, when are we going to see the pilot monitoring document out in the end? When's the Flight Safety Foundation going to release that?
Official rollout.
They're going to hold you to it now.
This time, I'm good for it. It's November. Flight Safety Foundation is going to roll it out November 10th through the 13th is sort of the launch date. So it'll be available for free on the Flight Safety Foundation website. So we'll make announcements and let you know when that's
Excellent.
the website.
So that's going to be out there, so our training managers know that, and it'll be available. Okay, last but not least, I want to talk about a guy who fills the pilot tool bag. You like Snap-on or Craftsman?
Both.
Both, yeah, you're a good political guy there. But this is the guy that helps us generate tools to put in the pilot tool bags. Captain Chris Reed from AQP manager from JetBlue. And I wanted to recognize Chris for always saying yes to come. I want to thank you for your volunteer work as a ALPA safety volunteer. You've done a great job in that. And we were just down at JetBlue with a number of other people in a go-around conference that JetBlue helped sponsor with the Regional Airline Association. And Chris welcomed a bunch of us and said, "Welcome to JetBlue University." And he says it's a pretty cool place when you have palm trees growing in the lobby of your training center. So that's always pretty cool. I remember that you have that welcoming environment, which I'm sure will continue as we go on. So Chris, thank you very much for coming and what you do. What Chris does is set the stage and give our pilots the opportunity to exercise these skills and take full advantage of AQP, to give our pilots the ability to fill a tool bag, realizing, as Dave said, it's impossible to practice every scenario. So I wonder if, going back to Al Haynes, I wonder if we went back to Al Haynes and say, hey, was it in the DC-10 syllabus to practice completely unhydraulic airplane? Probably not. But we got to have some tools to be able to handle it. Chris, you got it.
Thank you, Frank.
Sure.
And thank you very much for the invitation. Thank all of you for welcoming me back again. That's a great lead-in as we think about the question of what can training do to fill the pilot's toolkit, to prepare in the story Frank started out with, to prepare that crew for success when there they are over Lake Erie and have this smoke event, to prepare them for success. What can training do? Can training do anything? And by the way, before I even turn to the next slide, I want to know, Frank, how you got the script for our LOE coming up next year.
Yeah.
My team is in beta test right now for our...
Oh, is that right?
It's not a smoke fire fumes, but we are going from Chicago to New York. So I wondered, how do you knew that?
Well, you are our newest ALPA member, so we're just trying to take care of our members.
You got the inside scoop. Okay.
That's right.
All right. Well, any of our JetBlue guys out there listening, you now know what the city pair is.
There you go.
anyway, the question back to the question, which was, can training do something about this? And the answer, I believe, is absolutely yes, but I have to be the guy to just add a little bit of a note of caution, and Frank set this point up, is that we do have to be a little bit careful when you think about putting together training for an airline, not just talking about training sort of generally, but talking about operationally, how are you going to create training scenarios to help our pilots for this? Be a little careful that it's probably not so much about the specific event as it is the core skills necessary for managing this sort of class of events or these types of events. And I put a little cute picture here together, hopefully to stimulate a little smile, but maybe many of you can relate to this sort of a scenario. I remember after Captain Sullenberger and his crew so beautifully and successfully handled the Flock of Birds dual engine flame out ditch in the Hudson, the so-called Miracle on the Hudson flight, how well that was done. Would anybody out there be surprised that within about 30 days of that event, I was asked, I won't say by who, so are you going to do dual engine flame out ditching training in next year's CQT? Well, no sir, wasn't planning on doing that any more than I was planning to do the left wing falls off scenario. I mean, well, you have to be a little bit careful here. And I think the core message I'm trying to get across is not that scenario-based training in smoke fume situations is a bad idea. I am not saying that, so I want to be very, very clear. And in particular, Captain Dave Lawrence made some very good points about the operation of the mask and the setting up the communications, the audio panels for how are you really going to operationally use that mask. You have to train that. You have to practice that. There are some specifics about many of the scenarios here, some specific details where knowledge or skill to help you be successful in that area may be appropriate to train. I merely want to point out the cautionary tale that if you say, well, you know, here's the QRH, it's that thick, there are 425 different non-normals in it, show me in your AQP syllabus where you cover each of those. Well, none of us are going to be successful at that, right? So I just wanted to make sure that that's clear, and I like that little graphic. You know, have a dose of the tonic training,
right? Because
I think a lot of us in training find that we get that question a lot, don't we? So anyway, this next slide, I'm just saying I'm probably not going to do that. That X is slid a little bit in the graphic. I'm not sure what happened. It's supposed to be crossing out the wings fall off, but for the others, what I was trying to get at here is that if we say a class of event or types of things, I'm getting at a time-limited, high-complexity event.
Sure.
So if we take into account that we want to regularly train and ensure that the skill is there for operating the mask and maybe what some of the specific nuances of a fire checklist have to be, yes, we do need to cover that. But other than that, do I need to do a smoke, fire, fumes drill or loft type scenario every single recurrent training? I would suggest probably not, so long as we're covering those core skills, which I think have to do with time-limited, high-complexity events. So what do you need to do to be successful at that? Well, I think there are a few things. First, Dave mentioned the importance of flight path monitoring, flight path management. This is an eye chart not intended for you to read so much as just to serve as an icon. When the human factors working group that's putting together this flight path monitoring paper that Helena talked about, when that paper comes out, you'll see something like this and some description around it. But at JetBlue, one of the things we do to make sure that there's an appropriate crew focus on flight path monitoring, flight path management, is we have some training tools that we use. This happens to be a graphic that brings those things together, but some training tools that we use to try to make sure that there is a focus on flight path is always first. Whatever else is going on the flight deck, whatever other scenarios you may be facing or problems you may be facing, somebody's got to be flying the airplane. And so we have some things that we do to train that, and it doesn't have to be a smoke, fire, fumes scenario to train that concept. In fact, it can be anything going on, and you can train that concept. Secondly, as has been mentioned by several of my colleagues up here, we're talking about CRM skills, right? So a core skill to manage any high complexity, time limited event is CRM skills. Now at JetBlue, we kind of stopped using that moniker, CRM, and we've just gone over hook, line, and sinker to the phrase threat and air management. But you can call it human factors skills if you want, or human factors and safety, or CRM, or TEM, I don't care. My point is there are some things that are the softer skills around communication, time management, teamwork, et cetera, that form core skills that are going to help you be successful in any time-limited, high-complexity event. And I think we could probably agree that in the type of scenario that we've described here, a smoke, fire, fume scenario, the time management skill set, that part of your toolkit is going to get exercised. And the other thing, the final thing I would like to call attention to here is the basics of how to manage a non-normal. So when I think about the third of the three things I would say are really important as core skills for time-limited, high-complexity events, it's not only those CRM, TEM skills, but also, do you have the litany down? So what we find in training, and perhaps you folks have seen this too, and a lot of you that have trained up here, is that your airline will have some sort of a basic litany of a process. When something bad happens to me in the flight deck, I have a plan, and it's the standard operating plan for my airline. For example, almost everyone knows some version of maintain aircraft control, assess the situation, take appropriate action. Whatever that might be for your carrier. You know, we have a little litany at our carrier. Memory items, QRC, ECAM, QRH. You know, if you know that and are just comfortable with that, and it's just a thing you do, you're set up for success much more than crews that can't quite remember what do I do first? Wait, I know there's a drill I'm supposed to do here, but what do I do? So my point here is that if your training program exercises that skill set as well, so that it's very comfortable, that's a precursor, I think, for success as well. So these are what I think would be sort of the three areas that if whatever scenario you're using in non-normal training is focusing on honing these kinds of skills, flight path management, threat and air management, or CRM, TEM, whatever phrase you like to use, and having a basic comfort with how to manage a non-normal, the process for how to manage a non-normal, you're probably on the right track, I believe, to set your crews up for success in managing whatever tomorrow's high complexity, time limited problem might be, whether it's a fire or something else. I have a few final thoughts just to leave you with some maybe broadening ideas. Again, it's easy to talk about how you can train an individual or what you can experiment with in a controlled environment, but I look at the world from the perspective of a training program for our 26, 27 growing 2,800 pilots and 80, 90, close to 100 instructors in the schoolhouse, not counting line check airmen, that have to all deliver the same thing the same way every time. And so I'm always a little bit cautious to just remind folks when they say, hey, build a training scenario for this. Okay, but surprise, startle, if you give me 10 folks and we're going to run an experiment, I can create surprise and startle. Or if you put me in the simulator and you don't care if I do the same thing as the other 80 instructors, hey, just do whatever you want, Chris. Sure, I could surprise a crew. But when I'm trying to create a standardized training program that everyone does and everyone gets the same scenario and everyone grades it the same way and so on and so on, it's very, very difficult to create a surprise / startle. Because one of the reasons for that is the gouge will get out. In other words, pilots talk. It shows up, and so it doesn't, if my new training scenario comes out on September 1st, by September 7th, everybody's going to know the city pairs, so you didn't really hurt me, Frank. It's okay.
Okay.
It's no problem. Everyone's going to know what's coming, and so if I've got this little induced pop-up thing that's supposed to happen to create surprise or startle, it's not going to be surprising or startling to the crews on September 8th. And the environmental complexities, several of our panelists and colleagues have mentioned, for just one example, is even if you happen to have a smoke generator in your simulator, is it really generating a realistic smoke environment? All of the other complexities, ATC comm with the folks in the back, all the other things going on, very, very difficult to simulate. So again, what I take from that is not that, oh, throw up my hands, we can't succeed. It does, though, tend, in my mind, to reinforce the idea that if you're targeting the core skills, it's not so important that the exact environment that this exact scenario is about has to be exactly replicated if we target the core skills. The next thing I would say is I liked another point that Frank made, that, what's the grading criteria for an event like this? If you were trying to do it for a training event, it's not 1, 2, 3, 4 or something, it's survival, right? So if you are, and when you are setting up some sort of time-limited, high-complexity disaster event, I hope that you would consider it a training scenario, not a checking scenario. We certainly would never put this in a checking scenario. It would only be a training scenario. And then I'll just close with this thought. I suspect that Captain Al Haynes, Captain Sullenberger, as you just said, Al Haynes had not had a triple hydraulic failure that he practiced, and Sully probably had not had a dual engine flame out at low altitude that he had just practiced, and they did just fine. And smile and nod if you agree, but I find that crews that do very well on all the other stuff we train them to do, because they employ the core skills that we're talking about, they do very well when a unexpected, unplanned, high complexity, time limited thing comes up too. So if we're focusing on the core skills, I think we're going to be have our best chance of success, because who knows what tomorrow's disaster will be.
Thanks, Chris. That
Thank
was
you, Frank.
excellent. We all know in pilot training now that we're a data-driven organization. What can we measure improvement? Is a pilot better now? Is our pilot group more proficient in something 9 months after we started training? This stuff's pretty hard to measure, isn't it? These core skills. Are there some scenarios that you can put in place that you can actually measure performance at a period of time later, but kind of disguise it from the pilot? How do you do that? If you know what I mean. It's kind of a tough question. How do you know they're getting it? Is what I'm getting at.
Right. I think that is a really tough question, and I was having some conversations in the back room earlier today. At JetBlue, we've been really trying to push the boundary with some of the human factors training that we've done. And many of the folks in the room have heard me talk about that at different venues before. And if you haven't and want to hear something about that, I'll be happy to talk to you offline. But the question always arises, how do you know it's working? Yeah. And I'm the first person to raise my hand and say, I have only indirect measures or inklings of how well it's going. There are some things that I can see, but as you know, the measurements are, they're very tough to create because we don't have lab conditions. We have a real airline training department with real people. So, as Dave, you mentioned the importance of instructor evaluator training and standardization, right? So they're also your data collection mechanism. So it is very easy to tell, instructor John Smith, please write down or assign a grade number to whether they were within 20 feet of their altitude or 50 feet of their altitude or 100 feet of their altitude. It is much less easy to say, assign some kind of a grade for how well they managed time.
Exactly. Yes,
or how well they communicated. It's very, very difficult to do. Yeah. So we're trying to get some inkling to that. One of the ways we're doing it is we specifically ask our instructors in the comments field, when we have grade forms, we have comments field, to write about what they saw,
sure,
to try to describe it, to give some examples. So we're getting some insights, but I'll be the first to tell you that's difficult.
It's very tough to measure. And certainly, hopefully we don't have the ability to measure these during a LOSA, because we're hoping that is a routine flights, right? We don't want to go out there and say, well, we need at least 5 of our LOSA segments to have a near disaster. The traveling public wouldn't think much about that. That's what makes your job tough. That's what makes your job tough, because you're almost in a predictive world of what do we need to train. It's a tough job for our training management, and you only have so much time. You only have so many resources, right?
Absolutely.
So it's tough to measure. Okay, that was excellent.
Do you mind if I follow up on that point?
No, go ahead.
Frank?
Jump in there.
Because I really appreciated something that Dave said, and you kind of alluded to it as well. For everybody in the room, I think all of us working together, great point made here that if we continue as an industry to have the boxes you have to check, as opposed to are we really training what pilots need, boy, folks in my position, here's your budget, you got to create a training program. It just gets harder every year. There's never anything removed from my list of must trains. every year there's something added to my list of must trains. I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding going, oh yeah, I've been there. So, this is a thing I hope we can all work together with our regulators and others.
Absolutely.
AQP is supposed to provide the avenue, the toolkit to let you go to your regulator and say, well, look, we've done a task analysis, and it turns out we hardly ever fail an engine, so we don't really need to do V1 cuts.
Right.
Well, it turns out you're going to do V1 cuts.
Right.
And I'm only using that as an illustration. I'm not really suggesting
Absolutely.
that training our pilots on V1 cuts once in a while isn't a good idea. I'm not saying that. I merely say that we have to mean what we say about what can we realistically train and what's really the most important thing to train, not just box checking. So thank you for that.
Excellent point. And so taking full advantage of AQP and allowing us to use AQP in a proper way will ensure that we give our pilots those core skills that will allow them to survive the double engine flame out or these catastrophic type smoke, fire, fume situations. How many training managers do we have in the room? Any other training managers? Charlie? Do you see the same thing, Charlie, with the demands on the core skills from the regulators? What are you seeing out there? I know you don't have a mic right there, but you have a...
Frank, I've never put bashful without not raising my voice.
Absolutely.
Yes, in fact, it's been exacerbated by FAO Part 60
Right.
and some of the additional training requirements that are going on at the time. Recently, we've been successfully listed our POI with the revision to our AQP to move away from dual segment LOEs so that we can carve out another 90 minutes to 120 minutes for some specific training conditions.
That's excellent. So it is a struggle. Thanks, Charlie. There's only so much money in the budget, almost so much time for the pilots as well off the line. Okay, Dave, you have one quick comment, and then we're going to have 14 minutes or so questions. Dave.
Yeah, just in case it didn't come up is,
Sure. Thanks, Charlie.
I agree with Chris here is that one of the things I think that to move things along in the industry, and it's going to take some time, but we're data driven and everything has to go back to the data. And the question is, what I like to try to do is let's turn it towards the performance again and what the pilot actually needs and get away from the data, because the data is driving our training program, not what the pilot needs in the operation.
Yeah.
And if we can do that where we do less data gathering on certain aspects and do more on, and I think that's where we can work together is to move forward, is that because even with what we're doing here with even if we start doing cross-functional training and stuff, because as we're getting more and more towards next gen, things are becoming more complex. We're dealing more with air traffic controllers, dispatchers. It's not just a pilot out there by themselves trying to fly the airplane. We got everybody else involved. And we're going to have to start doing more training like that. So how do we do that? And with an SMS system and the airline and stuff, we can actually be having lofts, like Charlie's even talking about, putting those in there where we're actually checking the SOPs to see if they actually do work, as well as the pilots. And so everybody's getting involved, and as we move forward. So anyway, just throw that out in case it doesn't.
Yeah.
That's great.
We're going to have just a couple questions, but I wanted to throw this out to our scientists. It seems to me that we are trying to get very highly structured individuals. Well, let's step back for a minute. Some pilots really struggle with these unstructured scenarios. So is there something to be said for this? We're trying to get very highly structured individuals, pilots, to deal with a highly unstructured situation. So the pilots are naturally very structured people, procedure-wise. Give me a checklist, I'll do fine. In general, would that be not a personality trait, but a combination of skills that makes it more difficult, or does it make it less difficult for them to handle these unstructured situations? It's kind of, am I explaining that right? Or asking it correctly?
I'm not sure.
Well, thank you.
But let me just.
But we're very precise people. We like using checklists. Give me the checklist. I'll go step, 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 step. We're very good at that. But the unstructured situation, is that difficult for pilots?
I think it is, but I don't know that pilots as individuals necessarily started out being quite as structured as maybe they've become, because it is a very structured environment. We enforce it every day with our procedures, our checklists. You are driven to be very structured, right? And so that's why I think what Chris is saying in terms of really focusing on some core skills and And actually, one of the things that I would advocate, you didn't kind of go here, but one of the things I would really advocate to see in training is working to make things a little less predictable.
Yes, that's what I'm getting at.
Because the simulator, and maybe this is a limitation with the simulator, but when I've been observing training, the light always goes off.
Right.
The procedure always works. And you never are faced with the circumstance of really having to deal with something that didn't work as it was planned. And there was a study that I did a long, long time ago looking at just ASRS reports and identifying those events that seemed to have gone exactly as expected, exactly as planned, exactly as trained, as compared to those who did not.
Right.
And it could have been because of the crew performance, or it could have been because the materials they were supposed to use, the checklist wasn't quite right for this circumstance. 85% of the events were beyond the scope of published procedures, or something didn't go as planned or as trained or as expected. And so what I would say we need to do is to really help people, because I think Dave's right. I think with the added complexity with our aircraft, the kinds of events that we're going to start seeing where crews are really going to struggle are going to be those ones where everything has gone south and everything is lit up on the flight deck and you're just trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And so they're really highly complex, highly confusing kinds of things. And those are going to be the circumstances when we're really going to want the crews to have had the ability to practice, dealing with a situation that wasn't prepackaged and wasn't easily resolved.
That's good.
So.
Yeah, that's excellent. Very good.
Yeah, and I want to piggyback on that just briefly. I think pilots are very adaptable. As Dave said, only one flight out of 10 operates as originally planned. So, if you keep in mind that we're always shifting gears and always looking at different options and making the operation work, that's what we do. So I think, there is sort of a framework in place for us to be structured, but I think over time we've learned, because there is no perfect flight. I haven't had it yet, so we can shift gears pretty quickly.
Well, I'm going to start refusing that runway change then. I'm going to be very... So, with that said, we have about 9 minutes left for some questions. We're right on schedule. Thanks, you guys. So, I guess I'll run the Q&A. Who was up first?
Thanks, Mark.
Mark? Somebody.
Well, okay. I think he was up first, but I can go ahead and ask the question anyway.
Yep.
This question is basically for Helena and perhaps Dave. I think that the focus on the smoke, fire, fumes checklist for an early diversion is appropriate, and putting it right at the beginning that diversion may be appropriate puts the crew in the mindset of bringing the aircraft on the ground. And I think a lot of people are aware of this 17-minute average and that it might be sooner, and they have a very strong desire to land the aircraft. And what we've seen in a couple accidents for UPS 6 and also Asiana 991 is an immediate diversion and then a descent right down to 10,000 feet in an attempt to land the aircraft. However, in a cargo fire scenario, what you want to do is depressurize the airplane and keep it at 25,000 feet for as long as possible. So there's kind of a conflicting focus between bringing the airplane down and depressurizing and stopping the fire. And in both those cases, the investigation found that the fire progressed much more rapidly because they brought the aircraft down to a lot higher oxygen concentration level. So from a human factors perspective and from a training perspective, how do you balance this, land the airplane right now with don't descend below 25,000 feet?
I guess I can take that one a little bit and I agree with you, is that what I was trying to say earlier, and this leads right into that, is that we are trying to train pilots to follow checklists but not know the airmanship that goes behind it and what to do. And there's a lot of instances like what you're saying, with fires, with other things, that we have to have enough knowledge to know exactly what situation we're in and what to do when. So another example that's not even related to fires, but was when they lost the cargo door out of Hawaii back in the early 90s. It was the same thing. As I knew the guys on that airplane, if they had gone down and did the high dive that they trained all those years, they'd be dead today.
Yep.
But they just said, you know what? We don't know what we have. The airplane, we got structural damage. So they just did a glide, basically all the way back to Honolulu, and they started going down. So it's the same thing. Is that we're not training that airmanship, and that's where I think if we start integrating more of the CRM, all those airmanship qualities that we need to be training the pilots into the maneuvers, into the operations, and do that even without grading, where the pilots get a chance to exercise that, talk about it. That's what you're referring to there, I think. That would be excellent, because that's what we need to do. We need to train judgment. We need to train situational awareness, decision-making, all those things, but we're not. In the context of the observation, so we're saying, do the checklist, you get it, we check the box, we did it. But there's 20 different ways to do that. And then one other thing I mentioned is that with these scenarios that we're talking about, if you think outside the box, it would be nice, and when we come back as pilots, we don't know what we're going to get. I could get a stall, I could get a fire, I could get anything, but there's no right answer, and the instructor can do 15, or he's got 40 different scenarios he can run. That gets rid of the gouge. And there's carriers in the world that have done that.
Good luck building that.
And good luck building it and training the instructors to do it, but there are carriers that have done that because they don't need to collect the data to do it. So.
Yeah, and from a training manager, that'd be difficult, because you'd have to double you and Charlie would have to double your production staff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how to
Barbara.
do that, but
But you talked about the checklist, and so here's an opportunity where that template doesn't really match very well the needs of the cargo crew. And so here's a circumstance where you might want to change the ordering of things and what you actually have. Maybe you don't want to say diversion. Something else that I think that can often be added to checklists are some information about what the intent of these particular items are. Because again, remember, under high stress, your brain is not going to be working at 100% peak efficiency, so you may forget that the reason that I'm trying to, open an outflow valve or whatnot, to lower the PSI on the aircraft to starve the oxygen from the fire. It might not come together very easily and very quickly. So if we had some sort of little, kind of header for these particular items, starving the oxygen, starving the fire in these steps, just to help remind people of what they're doing. Those are some things that could be added to checklists to really sort of support them in these events.
Great point. Gentlemen, we got 5 minutes left.
Okay, real quick, can any of you comment on the value of the pre-flight briefing between cockpit crews and cabin crews, or between themselves, how valuable that is in a situation like you're talking about today?
Well,
Crickets, yeah, there we go.
crickets. Well, I'll take that for a minute. Here's what I would say. Clearly, it's very important. How are we going to communicate under duress? And it needs to be done. In a domestic operation, we're flying 3, 4, 5 legs a day. Sometimes crew changes. It gets extreme. I'll be perfectly blunt with you. It gets extremely difficult, or even impossible to do at some point. And therefore, connected to that, then, I think we need to go back to our training. And somebody mentioned, I can't remember, there was so much good information here. Training together with our partners in the cabin is important, because then some of those understandings would be standard operating procedure. Short of that, we are relying on a briefing that's quite honestly sometimes doesn't get done as effectively as we'd like.
I guess I'd like to see this group, or maybe next year, talk about us standing up and saying, hey, you're going to be 5 minutes late because you gave me 40 minutes to get from point A to point B and meet my new crew.
It's a very good point.
Perhaps we should start exercising a little more captain authority as a group. And
we're not going until it's
briefing.
done. That's an excellent, excellent point. We're not going to leave until we get an effective briefing done. Well done. It sounds like you got some applause for that.
Right, yeah.
Dave.
And Helena and I are actually on an aviation rulemaking committee right now, working on CRM with the different groups, which is dispatchers, flight attendants, and pilots. And we're just starting out. We're working on that to look at cross-functional training and briefings, and so we will definitely bring that up, because that is a very key point.
Great place to deposit that that concern, and
Let's go.
And it will be brought forward at an aviation rulemaking committee. There you go.
And just more of not a question, as a comment. I'm Laszlo Price, 767 Captain, ALPA member. You mentioned that a great majority of the incidents don't go as planned. And I feel...
You mean the flights don't go as planned?
Planned, but even the abnormals don't go as planned.
Sure, nothing goes as planned.
And the fact of the
Welcome
matter
to the
is,
airline industry. Yeah, right.
a great place there is system knowledge, and it used to be called ground school, and I don't think anybody has ground school anymore. We call it whatever we call it.
Distant education.
It seems like we get into this, I call the monkey way of flying. It's light goes on, open book, push switch, turn off the light, here's the banana pilot. You know, and there is so many times things happen where knowing a little bit about the system, you say, well, that cannot be, this is it, because there's too many conflicting information coming up.
That's a very good point.
So,
excellent, excellent comment. Thank you for that. Well, Captain Hogeman, we're almost at departure time. We've got a minute left. I want to thank you again, Chuck, for introducing us, and also want to thank the panel. It was great. Thanks so much. It sounds like we're going to talk about what it's going to be like on the ground here when we get on the ground with this. So I'll turn it back to Chuck, and you are all dismissed and thanked. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, panel. Very, very good. Before we break, I gave you two rules this morning. Number one is the rule is that when you registered, you were automatically entered into our raffle. The second rule was you had to be present. So before you run and grab a cup of coffee and take a look at some of the exhibits out there and do a little bit of networking, I'd like to go ahead and have Captain Cassidy